Hey, it's Mitch with just a little update on my new venture, Thinkers One. As a reminder, we've built a way for organizations of all shapes and sizes to buy bite-sized and personalized thought leadership video experiences from the best thinkers in the world. So what's changed? Well, we've realized that we need to make these thought leaders much more accessible. So when you head over to thinkersone.com, you will see that the pricing is very reasonable. Go and check it out. And all of these experiences are at least 15 minutes of pure brainy goodness. Now you can bring world-class authors, speakers, academics, captains of industry, and more into your everyday meetings or gatherings. It's really simple to use, and it's such a unique way for business leaders like you to buy completely personalized video content. You can book these thought leaders to pop in live at your next meeting or have a thinker record a presentation just for your team, or even as a great gift for clients. I'm really proud of the lineup of thinkers that we have. We've got great minds like Tom Peters, Rita McGrath, Michael Bungay-Stanier, Whitney Johnson, Mark Bowden, Dory Clark, Jay Bear, and so many more. So if you're looking to add insights, energy, and big smarts to your next meeting, corporate event, an offsite, a lunch and learn, even as a gift for that client, I know that you're going to love this. I invite you to head over to thinkersone.com and check it out. Now, back to the show.
Well, hey there, and welcome to episode number 924 of 6 Pixels of Separation, the Thinkers One podcast. My name is Mitch Joel. It's Sunday, March 24th, 2024. Let's get on with the show.
So who are you and what do you do?
Hi, I'm Coco Crummey, and I'm an applied mathematician and author of the new book, Optimal Illusions.
Yeah, this is a really fascinating topic. You're focused on this idea of optimization, which I think historically and maybe even currently people think is exactly what you have to do in life and business and everything. And you've put together a lot of really interesting thinking around maybe we've got it all wrong. And while I hate doing this, I think I would be remiss if we didn't start with at least clearing the decks and getting your definition of what optimization is. I found myself sometimes in the stories in the book and thinking about it, almost going to a dictionary and asking myself, is that optimization or is that not? I wasn't sure.
Yeah, and I think that's by design. I have a somewhat expansive understanding of optimization. In its most limited definition, it's a mathematical technology or a set of mathematical techniques that are used to find a maximum within some constraints. So you have an objective function and you're trying to find the parameters and the situation that best optimize a certain situation. In the kind of broader sense, which I'm more concerned with in the book, it's a way of seeing that preferences this kind of engineered way of looking at the world, a way that tries to find the best and tries to control and bound in to a certain frame.
So what was interesting, and that this might speak to the fact that I did so poorly in math, is I had no clue that optimization is actually math related. So for those who don't know, which I'm raising my hand and includes me, is it specific formulas or is it a theory that you set formulas to, just so that I understand this?
Yeah, it is a set of techniques or formulas. And depending on what you're trying to optimize and how complicated it is, whether you're talking about a dynamic system or a very stagnant system, there are different computational techniques. And some of them you can do with a pen and paper, and some involve computers and lots of computation. A simple example I give in the book is about lemonade. And if you're trying to optimize a lemonade recipe, the first question to ask with any optimization is, what are you optimizing for? So what is the best lemonade in your book? Is it one that's really sweet or sour or watered down or intense? And the second question is, how far can you stretch your definition of lemonade? Can you use some other fruit in there like limes or raspberries? And then what constraints do you have? Are lemons really expensive where you live? And the process of optimizing includes those first definitions, defining what you mean by a good lemonade and defining what you can and can't do. And then the process is to within those constraints, find the best recipe for lemonade. And that is often very simple when you're talking about lemonade. It's just, here's my recipe. Here's how many lemons I have. Here's how sweet I want to make it. This is the right proportion of lemons and sugar and water.
So let's talk about this idea of optimization and how it's become somewhat of a bad word in your book when it comes to work. Why would that be a bad thing that we're constantly trying to get to the optimum place?
Yeah. And I want to temper that a little bit by saying I don't think it's universally bad. I think optimization, like any technology, has given us a great deal of good things. As one example, the ability to travel and experience lots of different cultures and different places around the world through the optimization that has occurred in the transportation industry. The reason I argue for caution or thinking critically about how optimization has sort of percolated into not just our technologies, but our philosophies of daily living is that I think we need to be cognizant of the things that we've lost as we increasingly grow reliant on optimizations.
So walk me through what some of those might be for someone who might be shaking their head and thinking, we show up every day to make it better, to increase profits, to make people feel better. We have to optimize at every level. That's what we're doing here.
Yeah. I break the things that I see as losses down into three categories. And the first is I call slack or downtime, which are the redundancies that you often lose in systems when you optimize them or speed them up. And you could see this on a very basic level when you're talking about the optimization, the way that it's used colloquially, right? I've optimized my calendar. I've optimized my nutrition. Oftentimes, these optimizations don't leave enough space for rest or downtime. And that manifests in increased fragilities in the system, whether you're talking about an airline schedule or a biological organism like your body, right? If you have back-to-back meetings, that your productivity may increase, but your resiliency or your ability to bounce back if something happens might go down. The second category of things that I see as losses are around place and particulars. So one of the things that optimization does, the way it works, is that it requires an atomization of the world, a division into self-same units that can then be interchanged and abstracted, automated, and optimized. And when we do that, when we start to see the world increasingly in terms of a set of units, like dollars might be the simplest one. And I give the example of agriculture and how the industrial agriculture sector has evolved in the United States. When a system like agriculture becomes ever more focused on this one unit of productivity, yield per acre or dollars per acre, we lose a lot of the diversity of, in agriculture might be crops, but also the ways of seeing or valuing a system that don't lend themselves as easily to this kind of atomization. So that might be the conservation of soil or water quality. It might be the weave of the community that's lost as fewer and fewer people farm the land. And the third bucket of losses that I talk about have to do with scale and a loss of connection or integrity between part and whole. And I think the more that we optimize, the more we lose touch with what goes into that optimization. Lemonade or baking might be good examples here. When we go to Costco to buy like a giant 64-pack of packaged lemonade bottles or apple pies, that takes us one step further from the knowledge of how do we create lemonade in the first place. That's just a very simple example. And obviously, there are abundant examples in the algorithms that we rely on to run the software that underlies much of our day-to-day lives.
Can you talk more about that? This idea of figuring things out for oneself? I think there's a lot of merit in it. And I think it starts when we look at hobbies or maybe new skills that we want to acquire. But I could also look at things in my world, talked about one earlier, and say, as much as I practice, don't enjoy it, not good at it. Math being the thing that obviously was clear because I didn't understand that there was a mathematical sense around optimization. So there's that. And then there's also lifestyle. I have 3 kids. I'm working really hard. I'm a single mom. I don't have energy, time, or desire even to bake that apple pie. What happens? Walk us down this road of what we mean by figuring things out for ourselves and how much of our life should be encompassed by that versus our own pursuit of our interests, of our mastery, whatever it might be.
Yeah, I don't think there's a blanket answer for the should part of that question, right? Obviously, we live in a highly advanced culture. It's mind-boggling. Many of these beautiful and wonderful, and I'll call them shortcuts, really, optimizations that we rely on. I don't know how my computer works exactly in its entirety. I rely on tools when I live a fairly simple life, but for example, something as simple as chopping wood for a wood stove, that relies on tools that I couldn't mine these materials and forge myself. And I think there are very few people in the modern world who could actually subsist even, not to mention flourish, based on tools and ideas that they came up with single-handedly from first principles. That's the beauty and the benefit of living in a society and benefiting from one another's inventions. So I think when I say knowing things for oneself or understanding things from first principles, it's really about regaining that connection. And whether it's an understanding of what I know and don't know and the shortcuts I'm relying on, I rely on my computer, I rely on the cell phone reception to do certain things. And when those things go away, that is uncomfortable. So just being cognizant of those shortcuts, I think is important. I'll speak just for myself personally, seeking some of that reconnection that's been lost with optimization, especially in the last several decades. For me, it's meant human connection. It's meant connection with the food I eat, with the natural world, directly with ideas that I engage with by reading authors directly rather than through intermediaries, for example. I think those specifics will differ based on what people want in their lives.
I'm hearing a large battle cry for self-reliance, ultimately.
Yeah, and I'm hesitant there. I'm careful because I have to push back against the accusation sometimes that I'm a Luddite. I have some of those tendencies, but I certainly don't advocate a retreat to the woods for everyone. Even the father of self-reliance, Ralph Waldo Emerson, he only did it for a short time, right? Often these retreats or these opting out of society, especially today when we feel the push of optimization so much, the opting out is romanticized. And what happens when you romanticize something is that you don't see it fully, and it's also not real. It's not sustained. So I am skeptical of, there's a lot of cabin porn and companies that are profiting off of survival kits, so on and so forth.
Even the entire tiny home movement and all that. That's all.
Yeah. Van life took off during the early parts of the pandemic. I'd be curious for the statistics on how many of those vans that were were bought in 2020 and 2021 people are still driving happily around living van life, and how many are on the market now.
It feels like a large percentage of them are probably still stranded in the playa after this year's Burning Man, but that's another conversation.
Maybe, yeah.
I'm fascinated with those 3 areas that you spoke about: slack, downtime, place particulars, scale, loss of connection, because I'm reflecting on the fact that we probably just went through a global movement where if ever those 3 things would have become vibrant and truly alive, it would have been during the pandemic. We might even make the argument that we saw a lot of those shifts already take place. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the idea of optimization pre-pandemic and what you've seen since then. People are not going back to the office. People did move to more remote places. People took up hobbies for the first time in a long time, hobbies that require time and effort and don't necessarily evolve into a side hustle that you sell on TikTok. So, with that moment in time, in relation to this, how do you think optimization has been rethought?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've thought a lot about that because I have been contemplating this book for almost a decade, I want to say. But I really got into the thick of writing it at the very beginning of the pandemic when the air was like pregnant with change and something is happening, right? And also fear and hope and all these other things. And it's been interesting to observe. I mean, I think another thing that you didn't mention that also happened during the pandemic was that we became acutely aware of the fragility of some of these optimized systems. How do we get medicines to different parts of the world, even the developed world? We saw a few examples of supply chains just completely collapsing in various sectors. And the assumption that we would have even electricity on demand, which is something that I think most Americans take for granted at this point, that was challenged. The idea that we would have the goods that we could just click on our computers or our phone to have show up at our doorsteps a few days later, that was challenged. The idea that food would always be as inexpensive as it has been for the last 30 to 50 years in America, that is increasingly been challenged. That's something I call in the book a metaphoric breakdown. Like we have an idea, assumptions about how the world works that underlies a lot of the choices we make and the way our lives are organized. And we saw that breaking down a lot in a lot of ways in the pandemic. To your point, that was butting up against these personal choices and inclinations that maybe the way I was living my life doesn't make sense. I'm actually curious back to the how many vans are stuck on the playa right now. To me, it's interesting as some of these companies reinstate in-office policies and a lot of people decide that maybe their move to the backwoods during COVID, maybe that's actually not for them because they like the city. So some of those choices get reversed. I'm curious how much of the attitudes that were forged in those early pandemic days will stick and how many will be walked back. And I think as we walk them back, we confront this kind of almost despair, right? Like it seemed like there was a solution in getting out of the rat race, but maybe that's not a solution anymore. And so that's where I kind of feel we are now in this really uncertain space.
But economically, you have more than enough people who have made that choice, Coke. I mean, they've made the choice to maybe start their own business. Usually when that happens, it's more lifestyle driven. We've seen people actively do that. We've seen people change work more than we've ever seen. Even if you look at employee happiness, it's low, but it's not that much lower actually since before the pandemic. So because, it's at a record low. It is, but it's only a couple of points off of where it was before the pandemic. But again, you're hearing the outcry of smaller communities, more rural communities saying they don't have infrastructure for all the people who've not just moved, but stayed.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying that potentially these people will go back? Or my feeling is we're enough past it that these are permanent habits. Am I being too dismissive of it?
I have a sample size of one, which is the small community I live in. And I guess a fuzzy one because I talk to people in different small and large places. Some of these, I think you're right. There is an incredible stickiness to some of these choices. I think others, we're talking about a class of Americans, of people who have the fortune and the privilege to work in knowledge jobs or jobs that have geographic flexibility, which certainly isn't true for many, if not most Americans. But I have noticed here that there was a wave of pandemic people who moved in, and I'd say a majority of them are staying, but a not insignificant minority are discovering that they miss certain elements of living in an urban place, or the frustrations around the pace and the conveniences aren't worth it for them. I agree with you mostly, but I think there are some exceptions.
When you were thinking about optimization and digging into people and their habits, where does discipline, practice, general desire fit into this? Because that's where I probably struggled the most in reconciling it was I play music here and there, that discipline. I have kids. I'll often talk about in life, you'll either pay in discipline or you'll pay in regrets. It takes effort to do things. I was having a fuzzy time with the boundaries as I was reading this between wanting to be disciplined and practice and do things because there's value and an importance to it and effort against, well, is this just another game of optimization that I've told myself?
I struggle with that as well. For me, growing up in, with optimization in the drinking water, basically, and growing up in San Francisco on the cusp of a tech boom and then returning to work in a full-fledged new boom. And my family owes its presence in this country to having been good at optimization and engineering. I struggle with that too, because it's the way I look at the world in many ways. And I've had to work hard, speaking of discipline, to relax that way of looking at the world and find other ways or try to find other ways. I think a difference that I would point out between discipline and optimization or things that are practices. And I don't know if you've read, Matthew Crawford has a wonderful book. It's a little, maybe 10 or 20 years old at this point, Shop Class as Soulcraft. He talks a lot about practice and discipline in that. And the difference I see between that and optimization is optimization's goal is very top down. Its goal is to encompass and control, whereas practice and discipline is a bottom up thing that one does to build and improve and become better. And sometimes just for the joy of it, but oftentimes it does lead to mastery.
Have you thought about what the opposite of optimization is? I often ask people who come up with these differing definitions of words that have become commonplace or in culture, what the opposite is of that. And usually it's an interesting thought. And I was wondering, is you're grappling with this and thinking about it and writing about it, what's the opposite of optimization?
Yeah, I was asked a similar version of this question just recently, and I didn't have a good answer.
You have a better one now that you practice.
Well, I was given the straw man answer of apathy. Like, does it mean, well, we shouldn't optimize, we should just do nothing? Like, elections are just run by polling firms and gerrymandering and so on and so forth, so we just shouldn't vote at all. And my reaction to that straw man was absolutely not. We should seek to vote in those places or feel connected to one's vote, right? To our votes. And maybe that means focusing more on local elections and places where you can feel your impact or experience the impact of your vote directly. And that is where I land in the book as well, is the opposite isn't opting out or doing nothing or just going and meditating on a mountain and saying whatever happens, happens. To me, the opposite is from one's own values, making an active choice rather than trying to control the system and the outcome in the engineered way that we've become accustomed to through optimization.
So then would there be a sense of balance? Like, what would balance look like in that equation? I'm trapped in the world of optimization. I've been illuminated of rethinking this because of optimal illusions. I may not be able to get to that definition as you've defined it just now, Coco. What would balance look like to someone who is very open to this idea, but it's so new and intimidating because, let's face it, probably all of us are operating in a system that is fully constant, trying to optimize itself, much in the same way when I talk about crypto, we talk about decentralized or centralized systems. And I half laugh because we're talking about a decentralized thing. But if something goes wrong, everyone runs to centralized systems, like the legal system, to fix it. So I'm asking it in that type of way of, is it possible for us to think about balance in a world where clearly everything around us is driven by optimization? As we're talking, my laptop is notifying me that there's an update. It's an update to obviously optimize the system.
Right. I would frame it in terms of how can I as an individual shift my way of looking at the world? To me, finding balance is difficult because it implies a steady state. And one of my pet peeves are these, as you may have noticed, are the solutionists, the extreme solutionists that come out of Silicon Valley and try to fix what the shortcomings of optimization with more optimization. So we're not going to reach a perfect balance through a formula or through more optimization. I completely understand that that wasn't what you were implying, but I just want to belabor that point. And I do think finding that more colloquial balance involves just shifting one's perspective and trying to find those connections to some of those things that have been lost, focusing more on the place and the particulars and the local, trying in small ways to reintegrate redundancies and downtime, seeking as much as possible in one's own context to understand things from first principles and understand the shortcuts that you're taking. So my computer installs updates too, and I understand, we'll never really understand what they are. Maybe that's a shortcut I've accepted, or maybe I turn off the automated updates, I turn off the push notifications, et cetera, et cetera. Those are just small examples.
I'm finding myself falling down the rabbit hole of conversations I've had with people like Cal Newport, who I know blurbed your book, as well as people like Johan Hari, and thinking about how it's greater than the concept. There's a culture that we're all in. Some people call it Moloch, even this race that we're all in that will benefit no one ultimately in the end. And it's challenging. As you were talking, I was thinking about this new project. I'm sure you've heard about it in Solano County, California Forever, where a bunch of tech billionaires and others have acquired a bunch of land and are trying to build, whether it's a techno-utopian city, I don't know, but this idea that we can probably do it better than government. And I vacillate on this. I think in one sense, it's completely absurd. Like, this is ridiculous. On the other sense, it's hard not to look at governments in general. And again, I live in Canada and think about my tax rate, my sales tax rate after that. What are the services? Can't find a doctor, not enough nurses, not enough teachers, public school systems falling apart, healthcare system. Not like, you look at it and go, maybe somebody else does have a solution. And while perhaps they used optimization to get there, it might ultimately still be a better solution than what we're dealing with.
Yeah, I certainly understand the temptation. And I did read a little bit about that. And it reminded me 15 or 20 years ago, Peter Thiel had
the boat.
The concept. Or? Yeah, exactly. A boat in international waters. And my perhaps a little mean take about some of these extreme libertarian efforts is that they all need to get in the sunshine a little bit more and get a little bit of a tan and understand that the world, I think a second grader might have some good counter arguments on why starting a society on a container ship or whatever kind of boat it was might run into some issues. But I also agree with you. I don't actually see that much difference between if it's a set of private individuals doing it or businesses or corporations versus the government. The optics are very different. The PR is very different. The actual tactics of how these things are organized are different, but they're both seeking the same goal, which is not, they're good goals, right? It's how do we ensure human flourishing in a society of limited resources, and how do we balance equality with individual freedom? How do we balance care with autonomy? Both governments and markets or corporations are in different ways trying to seek those goals. The danger comes in with complexity and an over focus on this kind of streamlined, efficient, top-down organization of the world.
Okay, so you mentioned how kids might look at something like the Peter Thiel idea, but it was something that came to me when I was reading Optimal Illusions, this idea of maybe we can get adults to think about this, but maybe the low hanging fruit in terms of optimizing non optimization, sorry to do that to you, would be to somehow teach really young kids about this. It seems like the habits and skills we're giving them are double reinforcements leading to optimization versus perhaps there is a different path. Do you think that that might be a viable path, or the reasonable path is let's start getting the kids around this first?
Oh, for sure. That naturally happens as cultural and societal norms and ideas and perspectives change. Back to our earlier bit, there is this opening for them to change if they haven't already changed in a sticky way in America or in the West. There's this huge opening right now for those norms to shift. And we already see it at the margins of parents questioning screen time, for example, and questioning some of these assumptions that had been made about child rearing in previous generations.
It's a really challenging issue because as a parent, you've got your kid in a pedagogy that's driven by your state, your province, your country. You want them to achieve, you want them to excel, you don't want them left behind. As ridiculous as the education system is, another definite form of Moloch, if ever there was one. It's a system that benefits no one, and yet we continually jump and move ahead with it. And yet it feels to me the natural place to go is here. And I know that when it comes even to things like screen time, the real problem tends to not be the kids, but the parents. The parents are the problem, not the kids. So you can teach the kids, but if they're going home and they're modeled after the parents, it's not going to get any better. But when I think about it as an idea, this idea of how do we look at optimization and did we get it all wrong? It feels like the easier, and again, I recognize words I'm using might lead us down the road if you're trying to optimize for this, Mitch, I get that. But it would seem that the younger generation might be the place to start so that in years and years versus tomorrow, we actually see a shift in how they perceive things. Because ultimately, I think it's driven by a lot of the ideals we have about money and status.
Yeah. Even though this evolution of the idea of optimization is a much longer thread in our history, I do think that the last 50 years, let's say, have seen not just an acceleration of an encroachment of the technology from the financialization of everything to just the rise of Silicon Valley and the extreme, the mind-boggling increase in compute power, which has allowed optimizations to happen at an unprecedented scale. The last few generations, the millennial generation in particular, is steeped in these ideals, whether it's personal achievement or optimizing us for a certain lifestyle. And to the extent that I've experienced Gen Z, let's call them, I see a different ethos in that generation, which I kind of like.
And then I'm wondering, what if it's not external but internal? And that makes it even more challenging because perhaps it's evolution. This is what evolution does, and it is literally in our DNA to continually try to create the next best.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point that I'm sure we could have an entire separate podcast about if we wanted. But I do think there are important differences in how evolution occurs and plays out in the natural world versus how we engineer and quote unquote evolve systems when as humans. Evolution as it plays out in nature is often full of mistakes and missteps and circuitous paths, which the project of engineered optimization is trying to, as much as possible, avoid those things.
Yeah, more in the move fast, break things type of world. Is that what you're saying?
That's a nice gloss on what's actually happening, especially these days at companies like Facebook. My impression is that those are some of the most optimized and also boring places these days, right? And in terms of how work is done, that might have characterized a different era in technology, the move fast and break things.
But with things like that, you do see reactions. Every action has a reaction. This idea that if you looked at Amazon and said similar things, you could look at something like Etsy and go, wow, look at how we are connecting back to a different type of product, whether we like that commercialism or not. But there's even pushes against that, or the system in and of itself tries to optimize like an Amazon. It's a fun thing to watch. I'm just wondering what your thoughts about this push towards craft, this push towards solopreneur, this push towards paying more for products of quality, but it's still all part of this weirdly optimized system.
Yeah, I love that push and that impulse. My own personal jury is a little bit out on Etsy because I think it enables this kind of work, but it is at the expense, the small expense, but the expense of the creators in favor of the platform. That leads to weirdness versus if that craft were sold as it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago in the more local markets in which it was created, it would not allow that individual to maybe scale and earn the same kind of living as 100 years ago. At the same time, I think there are weirdnesses when something that's local is blasted through this platform all around the world. And then obviously we have to keep a small amount of caution about the power of the platforms themselves.
I would be remiss if we didn't at least try to tackle the idea of artificial intelligence. It seems like if we're thinking about the work you've done in optimal illusions and then related against AI, I feel like AI would actually be the alpha male of optimization in our world right now. Any thoughts on it?
Yeah, I tend to be a little bit skeptical of AI, or at least how it's been hyped these days. I think we're in a little bit of a hype bubble around it. There is some there, though, and in particular in the scaling up of computing power that has driven a lot of this work in the recent work in AI. A lot of the modeling approaches actually aren't that different from what existed since basically the 1970s, although there has been a little bit of invention and evolution there as well. AI, or the sort of recent developments in large language models, will have some effect on knowledge work and the structure of labor these days. The jury is still out because of all the hype. I don't know that it will live up to our greatest hopes and fears, but I am interested to see how it plays out.
But you could walk it down a little bit and at its core think we might be on some type of edge of creating something that would be more intelligent to us, which would then force us to actually define what intelligence is. It would seem to me like we have to think very seriously about it in relationship to everything around optimization. If we have put in place systems that are more than exponentially, that is a mathematical term I learned the hard way, efficient and effective, we may have to look seriously at how we define intelligence to date. If it's able to outmaneuver us and do things to us, this goes back to my theory of if this does deliver on any sort of promise, it could be the alpha male of optimization that we may not want to be around.
Yeah, I guess I'm a little bit more
Skeptical of that.
skeptical about the intelligence part of AI and the I part. It's narrowly intelligent in the sense that we've defined computer intelligence with this Turing test framework. I don't see this technology as rivaling human intelligence and complexity anytime in the near future. That's not to preclude other developments. I'm more optimistic about human potential and flourishing.
Okay, we'll put a pin in it, try to come back and see
Perfect.
where it lands in the future. Before we go, tell me one thing that made you think differently.
Gosh, even with the hour of forewarning, I haven't had time to think about that. I'll tell you the first thing that came into mind, and I'm sure after we end, I'll think of a dozen better ones. But what first popped into mind is almost 20 years ago, I was in El Calafate in Argentina, in the south of Argentina, at this glacier. It's called the Perito Moreno Glacier. And it's one of the only advancing ice fields in the entire world. And what it does is every so often it dams up, the ice creates a dam in this body of water that separates it, and the water pressure builds up. It's two sides of a lake essentially. And on one side, the side behind the glacier, that level rises and builds up this pressure against the ice dam such that every 3, 4, 5 years, it ruptures the dam and it's this like crazy ice show of glaciers, icebergs and pieces of the glacier like crashing down into the water. And I just happened to be there. I was living in Argentina and happened to travel down there and be there on the very day after this time it had gone on for 18 years that this dam was building. And it started rupturing and crashing, and the auditory experience, not to mention the visual, is just beyond words. And I suppose that it's different than a book or a painting that changes one's ideas about the world. For me, it really connected these different scales of environmental time, basically, and how things change at these massive scales. The fact that it was brought down to human scale for that one day for the people who happened to be there, and we could experience this very thrilling event that doesn't happen so often. That was really moving and I'd even say life-changing for me.
I love that example. It's great. So the new book is called Optimal Illusions. Coco, let people know where they can find out more information about the book, and if you're creating another type of content, or if you are living remotely and or trying to not optimize for anything.
Well, I certainly still optimize for some things. You could find the book anywhere books are sold, starting with Amazon and Bookshop, right down to many of your local booksellers.
That's great. Coco, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Mitch. Really enjoyed it.